We have a very full auditorium here. Thank you very much for coming out. I'm Brian Campbell. I'm a member of the Palestine Awareness Committee and some other Palestine committees, solidarity committees, and we're the group that's organized it tonight. I want you to look around and note that you're a little under half of the plane load that Stephen Harper took to Israel.
At our expense.
At our expense, yes. And I'll have a comment to make about that later.
Get rid of it?
Yeah. So just to give you a few minutes background here, you may have remembered that last fall some ads were put up in SkyTrain stations and on the side of buses depicting the disappearing Palestine, the ads across the top there. And it created a great deal of controversy in Vancouver, and we had quite a bit of support, quite a bit of media support, interestingly enough, including the National Post. So that was very good. The reason we got so much attention, of course, is the Zionists made a big deal about this going in, and we had a lot of free speech support. And about a month later, we renewed the ads, and they were ripped down 3 times in the Georgia and Granville SkyTrain station. And so we put them up in the SkyTrain station, and they did well there. But after that, the StandWithUs, a very right-wing pro-Zionist group in the United States, from the United States, that Pam Jeller is associated with, put up the ads across the bottom. So that's the genesis of tonight's discussion. There were lots of questions that were asked about the origin of those, the origins of those maps, and for the uninitiated, they wanted to know who was right and who was wrong, which maps were right and wrong. So we're very privileged tonight to have Dr. Hani Faris give us a background on the maps. Dr. Faris is an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty associate in the Institute of Asian Research at UBC. He served as the faculty of the Political Science Department at Kuwait University, the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard, the Department of Political Science and the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill, and the History Department at Simon Fraser University. So he's traveled a little bit. He's written a number of books. I'm only going to mention a couple of the most recent ones. The One-State Solution to the Arab-Israeli Conflict, A Country for All Its Citizens, 2011, and Failure of the Two-State Solution, The Prospects of a One-State in the Israel-Palestine Conflict. He's also written more than 50 book chapters and articles in professional journals. He has served as the Assistant Director General of the Palestine Research Center from 1967 to 68, Academic Vice Dean for the Graduate Studies at Kuwait University, President of the Association of Arab American University Graduates, Advisor to the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security, member of the Board of Editors of Arab Studies Quarterly, member of the Board of Editors of Contemporary Arab Affairs, policy advisor to the Palestinian Policy Network, and president of the Board of Directors of the Trans-Arab Research Institute. In short, his qualifications far exceed those of Pam Jeller. I welcome Dr. Faris.
Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the organizations that sponsored this function, and to thank, in particular, Brian Campbell and Marty Roth for their invitation and for the many sessions we held together discussing how to organize this event. It all started in Denver, Colorado in 2012. At Denver, two organizations sought and failed to place billboards calling for an end to US military aid to Israel. Their ad said, "Tell Congress, stop killing children. No more military aid to Israel." Of course, the agency refused to put up these ads on its billboards. They rejected the ads, and they told the two organizations, "You are not allowed to bring up the words Israel or Jew." That was fine. So the two organizations resubmitted an ad that said, "Want peace? Stop ethnic cleansing in Palestine." The ad was again refused, and this time no excuse was offered. The organizations decided then to adopt the tactics used by a New York-based organization called Freedom Defense Institute, which succeeded in placing its overtly bigoted and hateful anti-Muslim ads in public transit advertising space in both New York as well as San Francisco. These ads had originally been refused, and what Freedom Defense Institute did was to obtain a court order which argued that public, in contrast to private ad spaces, are subject to the rules of free speech. Encouraged by their findings, the two organizations demanded their ads be placed on public buses and called on the advertising agency to respect their freedom of speech. After much deliberation, the ad was placed inside and outside public buses in Denver, Colorado. Pro-Israel organizations seem to have decided not to challenge the ad in the courts for fear that the courts, in examining the statement that Israel is ethnically cleansing the Palestinian population from their country, could actually decide that the statement is true. And that would be disastrous. It would set a precedent all over North America. So they decided not to challenge it in court and to let it happen. They decided not to poke a beehive and to trigger a discussion on disappearing Palestine. A group called Palestine Awareness Coalition asked TransLink to post an ad titled Disappearing Palestine that shows 4 maps that you can see on the wall and the statement that there are 5 million Palestinian refugees. The maps went up on Tuesday, August 27th. They were displayed on the outside of 15 buses and at a wall mural in a downtown SkyTrain station for 30 days. The wall mural was extended for another 30 days, and the second was posted at the Oak Ridge station. The murals were torn, as you mentioned, and replaced 3 times. In all likelihood, the identity of the perpetrators is known to TransLink and to the RCMP. Why? Because these areas are covered 24 hours by cameras. In spite of the extreme pressure applied on TransLink, their public transit authority announced the maps. This public transit authority announced the maps will stay up because they comply with Canadian advertising standards and do not violate any human rights. A very interesting statement that was posted on the website of TransLink. TransLink staff had asked for legal opinion, advice, and were told they could not reject the ads because of an earlier decision by the Supreme Court of Canada regarding posting of ads and the freedom of expression. The TransLink board was not satisfied, and it commissioned a second legal opinion. They were told the same. The BC Civil Liberties Association concurred with the legal opinions. Its executive director announced, to quote, "As a government agency, TransLink has got to respect freedom of expression. They cannot deny that to people just because the content of the message may be political. It's pretty cut and dry from our perspective." Immediately after the ad was posted, a controversy raged in the city, in Canada, nationally, and internationally, all because of 4 maps. What explains this phenomenon? What did the maps say that made them touch a raw nerve? Essentially, there were 2 groups to the controversy. The first was represented by the pro-Palestinian Palestine Awareness Coalition, and the second was represented by the pro-Israel spokespersons and organizations of the Canadian Jewish establishment, and an Israeli organization called StandWithUs. It would be worthwhile to survey the arguments and examine the logic or rationale used by both to explain their position. Let us start with the initiators of the ads, the Palestine Awareness Coalition. The coalition is made up of 7 organizations: Boycott Israeli Apartheid Campaign, Building Bridges, Canada-Palestine Association, Canada-Palestine Network, Independent Jewish Voices, Seriously Free Speech, and Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights. An 8th group joined later, which is Canadian Sabeel. A quick look at the names of the organizations indicates 2 features. One, there are Palestinian, Jewish, and non-denominational groups in the coalition. 2, some are totally dedicated to the issue of Palestine. Others have a much wider interest. Clearly, what forms the common denominator among them is the defense of issues of freedom and human rights in general, and that of the Palestinians in particular. A spokesperson for the 7 groups, Charlotte Cates, gave 3 reasons for the ads: highlight ongoing human rights violations against the Palestinians, demonstrate the successive occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory, and 3, raise awareness among the people of Vancouver of what is happening to the Palestinians. Another member of the coalition, Ada Glustein, explained the goal of raising awareness in the following words, to quote, "Awareness is the seed that is needed for the plant to sprout and for any positive action to flourish. The coalition wanted to tell the Palestinian story without blame or venom." Ada explained that it was her Jewish background and upbringing that taught her to question, to become a critical thinker, and to see beyond the pale. She concluded her piece by addressing members of the Jewish community in Vancouver who are afraid to be aware of the Palestinian condition with the following call, to quote, "Open your eyes, look at the map and see the reality. Palestine is disappearing. Homes are disappearing. Orchards are disappearing. And the Palestinian people, as fellow humans, need to be seen, heard, and counted just as any other group on this earth. Seeds of fear and bitterness grow into hatred, separation, and isolation. Better to plant seeds of compassion, seeds of understanding that can grow into just, safe, and caring communities." Finally, Tyler Levitan of Independent Jewish Voices Canada said, "As a Jew, I feel unsafe by what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, not by the non-violent resistance of Palestinians to Israel's crimes." These then were the arguments advanced by the spokespersons of the Palestine Awareness Coalition. It is definitely worth pointing out that those who defended, explained, and justified the ad campaign were predominantly Jewish. What about the positions of the Jewish pro-Israel groups, and how did they explain and defend their positions? In the B'nai B'rith, National Director of Legal Affairs, to the B'nai B'rith, National Director of Legal Affairs, Anita Bromberg, the Vancouver ad campaign is only a part of a larger campaign to wipe Israel off the map. It is very derogatory of Israel and its supporters, who can be a target of hate, violence, and other acts of mischief. So according to the spokesperson of B'nai B'rith Canada, these maps are part of a much larger conspiracy to erase Israel off the map. To the B'nai B'rith Canada, the groups that sponsored the ad campaign are anti-Israel groups. and, to quote, fundamentally anti-Semitic. In other words, Anita and her organization saw in the ad campaign a large conspiracy to wipe out Israel and the supporters of Israel. Pro-Israel organizations in Vancouver were not satisfied with just condemning the Disappearing Palestine ad campaign. They went to lengths to force TransLink to pull out the ads and threatened it, as well as the coalition, with legal action. A review of the bulletin issued on August 28 and labeled Important Community Update by the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Pacific Region, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver is worth examining. It spoke of, to quote, a sustained campaign, both public and unannounced, waged to have the ad removed. The campaign went on for 6 weeks, prior to the posting of the ads. For 6 weeks, there was an immense, intense campaign to remove the ads. Nobody knows this. Hardly anyone knows this. And continued after they were posted. The campaign targeted TransLink management as well as board of directors. It sought to enlist mayors of Greater Vancouver, BC members of the Legislative Assembly, labor and professional unions, and federal cabinet ministers. The campaign failed to achieve its target. It was unfortunate that instead of respecting and recognizing that TransLink was under the legal obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian Awareness Coalition to freedom of expression, they attributed the failure, guess what, of their campaign to the fact that the ads targeted Jews, according to them. The co-chairs of the Center for Israel, the co-chair of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, lamented that if the campaign had targeted non-Jewish groups, the situation would have been taken more seriously. In the aftermath of the pressure campaign, an organization called StandWithUs, that describes itself as an international Israeli education organization with the slogan "Supporting Israel Around the World," came forward. It submitted to Advertising Standards Canada, a national regulatory body for the Canadian advertising industry, complaints regarding the ad, which were registered with Advertising Standards Canada as case numbers 19262, 19263, 19261, 19246, and 19250. In one passage, the complaint reads, to quote, "The ads are totally incorrect and cannot be substantiated by any level of research or historical correctness. The information is inflammatory and biased and basically a lie and does not meet the standards of truth in advertising. The ads must be terminated immediately." The Palestine Awareness Coalition responded to the complaints, and Advertising Standards Canada accepted their replies and decided not to pursue the matter any further. Having failed to sway Advertising Standards Canada, StandWithUs moved to develop its own ads which included 3 maps and were placed in Vancouver transit stations in October of 2003. They are the 3 maps in the bottom. To sum, in all their comments, the pro-Israel groups have, without exception, taken a very rigid position. They see no value or merit in the Palestinian Awareness Coalition ad, and they deny that the maps have any basis in fact or reality. After the second set of ads came out, I sent both sets to a colleague of mine, a close friend of mine, who is a senior partner in one of the major law firms in Vancouver. I said, look what's happening. He wrote back and gave me the following comment. I find the Disappearing Palestine ad to be very effective. The response is interesting. It likely reflects how they truly feel, and the factual inaccuracies are irrelevant to them. We must keep in mind, though that the vast majority of the public is ignorant about Palestine. Therefore, the inaccuracies mostly do not matter much. And their ads speak mostly to those who blindly follow their mantra in any event. I agree with him. But to be able to deal with a situation like this, what I suggest to you, that we in this session acquaint ourselves with the maps, know how to interpret them, give the historical context of maps, and then we know what positions to take and how to explain them to the public. Let's begin with the first map of Stand With Us, Ancient Jewish Kingdom 1000 BCE. 3,000 years ago? What is that supposed to mean? What significance does it have to 2014? Is there a relationship? No, no, and no. None. But why put up something like this? Sure, in 1000 BC, there was a time when Hebrew tribes that came from the Arabian Peninsula and went into the land of the Canaanites, established kingdoms, and during the reigns of King David and King Solomon, created large kingdoms, which later on, and within the span of 2 generations, then shrinked, divided, fought each other, and there were many other kingdoms in the land of Palestine. So, of course, what Stand With Us wants you to do is to believe that the land Hebrew tribes occupied on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, what we know as Palestine or Palestinian lands, remained the ownership of Jews until today. And why is that? It is because of the racist philosophy that the Zionist movement actually presents to you. And when I say racist, it's not because I want to throw these adjectives lightly. Actually, if you read Herzl, and if you read the compatriots of Herzl, who created the Zionist organization in the late 19th century, they say about themselves that they are racist. What is the issue? How then do we have the problem today of Palestine. And how do we have an entity come into being in the 20th century called Israel? And why do we have this problem continuing? It all began not in 1000 BC, not in BC, not in 1000 AD. It began in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. And it relates to what we know as the Jewish problem. This problem dates to mid-19th century and is attributed to the rise of secular anti-Semitism in Europe. In contrast to religious anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church, this secular anti-Semitism rested on two doctrines. One, the nation state, and second, racial purity. It was also a time when most European governments had adopted legislation granting their Jewish citizens civil rights under the influence of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic reforms. In the early 1880s, world Jewry counted about 7.75 million. The whole world Jewry in the 1880s counted about 7.75. Of the 7.75, 5 million lived in Russia alone. Jews of Central and Western Europe constituted about 13.5% of world Jewry. Asian African Jews counted 8%, while Jews in the US at that time counted 3.5% of world Jewry. So what do we have here? The Jews of Russia were restricted, as you know, to what was known as the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement is an area that extends from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And that corridor, Jews of Russia were not allowed to go further east. They were not allowed to inhabit Moscow or Pittsburgh or other cities. They were forced to remain within the Pale of Settlement. And within the Pale of Settlement, they lived in what is known as ghettos, or Jews-only areas or quarters, whether in cities or in villages and towns. But as the reforms spread and the walls of the ghettos began to crumble, the phenomena of the pogrom spread and intensified. Pogrom are the attacks on Jewish civilians, killing them, displacing them, taking away their belongings, a very hateful kind of movement that was directed at the Jews of Russia in the Pale of Settlement, and they were then blamed for all the ills of the Russian Empire. In contrast to the experience of the Jew in Europe and Russia, their experience in the Muslim world was quite different. Throughout the 14 centuries of Islamic history, Jews sought and found refuge among Arab Muslims and Muslims in general. One of the noted Jewish intellectuals of the late 19th century, early 20th century, Israel Moses Zangwill, wrote in 1902, I spent 2 years of my life studying Israel Moses Zangwill and the Jewish national movement. And that was my master's degree. This is why I know it. So, what did he write? To quote, "Looking around the world, we see to our astonishment of all countries inhabited by a large Jewish population, only one country free from anti-Semitism. One country alone free from anti-Semitism. Only one country in which the Jewish inhabitants live at absolute peace with their neighbors, and that is the Ottoman Empire." What is the Ottoman Empire? It is Turkey, the Arab world, North Africa. That's the Ottoman Empire and the Balkan states. Now, Israel Moses Zangwill was one of the founders of the World Zionist Organization, and he is supposed to have developed the intellectual basis of Zionism. And he was the one who propagated the slogan, "A country with no people to a people with no country." Recall that? Now, usually scholars attribute the slogan to him. He's not the one who coined it. It was someone else. But he's the one who publicized it. What then is the Jewish problem? Jewish problem was a European and, in specific, an East European problem. Now, why am I giving you this historical context? You want to understand these maps? You must understand how the problem came into being and how it evolved before we go to specific maps. Now, 5 responses developed among Jews regarding Jewish habitation among Christians in Europe. Remember, something like 90% almost of where Jewry were in Europe. 5 responses. The first was pietism. Basically, religious leaders of the Jewish communities said, going back to Palestine is a divine act. Comes when the Christ comes. For any secular movement to say we will go into Palestine and set up a commonwealth is against the tenets of Judaism. So the answer to the problem is more piety, more attachment to your Jewish roots. The second was assimilation. Some intellectual came and said, why are we being hated? Why are we being attacked? It's because individuals don't like those who are different than them. Groups don't like other groups that are different from them. So the answer is to accept the nationality of the place we are in and assimilate. And the most unfortunate matter is that the most assimilated Jews in Europe were the Jews of Germany. And the third response was emigration. Okay, we get suppressed in one place, we go to another place. We get repressed in the second place, we move to a third place until we find a refuge. And based on this kind of thinking, about 1 million Jews moved from East Europe to West Europe and North America in the period between 1880 and 1905. So within 25 years, more than 1 million people packed their bags and moved from Eastern Europe into Western Europe and North America. And the fourth answer was that of rebellion. This was the age of the great ideologies: liberalism, socialism, nihilism, imperialism, and what have you. And the Jewish intellectuals and Jewish youth said, the reason for our repression is the socioeconomic conditions of our societies. And to be able to address them, we need to become involved in movements that will reform European societies and change them. And this is why you find a lot of Jewish youth in the second half of the 19th century joining revolutionary movements. By 1917, when the communist revolution took place in Tsarist Russia, the grand majority of the Politburo of the Communist Party was Jewish. What does that mean? Now, for anti-Semites in specific, they took this as an indication that communism is a fabrication of Jews to undermine the free world. For those who know their history, they appreciate what these brave people did by sacrificing themselves, taking the risk, and joining reform movements. And the last of the 5 responses was Zionism. The intellectuals of Zionism said, we are Jews, we will always be Jews, and we will always be hated by the world. There never will be a time that we will be accepted. And why is that? Because we are abnormal. And why are we abnormal? Because we don't have our state. So if we become normal and have a state of our own, a Jewish state, then the world will accept us. So the aim was to create a Jewish state. And to create a Jewish state that makes sense, they posited the formula that Jews all around the world form one people and one nationality. And many of these intellectuals went further and said they are one race. Well, they began to work, and the first major act was the establishment of the World Zionist Organization in 1897. But soon after, within years, they began to differ, disagree, crumble, and in the early years of the 19th century, in the early years of the 20th century, they actually were at the verge of shutting down their shop. What saved the World Zionist Organization and Zionism was not any major movement or groups within Zionism or within the Jewish communities. It was the force of the British Empire, England, that came to the rescue, and the policies that were enunciated in its Balfour Declaration. Be patient. Hold on, we'll get to these maps. But to understand them, you need to know these matters. What was the Balfour Declaration? This was the declaration which became the cornerstone of British policy in Palestine from the moment it occupied the country until its withdrawal in November 1947. During this time, the British administration helped lay the foundation of a Zionist state that was declared in May 1948. This is why it's important that you know the document. Now, the document consists of 67 words only, 67 words. Each word was thoroughly examined and weighed before it was issued. The text is deliberate, and where it is vague, vagueness was intentional. Negotiations took place over a period of 3 years. Now, these negotiations were between 3 parties: the British government on the one hand, a delegation from the World Zionist Organization, and finally, a group of eminent members of Anglo Jewry. I'm not going to take you into too much details, but I would like to review with you what were the objectives of the British government and why did it issue this strange document called the Balfour Declaration, which called for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jews. National home itself is an indeterminate expression. It's not found in legal text. This was something new. There were 4 objectives that the government had. 1, reduce and redirect the influx of Jewish immigrants to Great Britain. Take them away from Great Britain. In 1905, England had passed an alien bill which aimed at keeping Jews out of England. Remember, England had a history about this. For 350 years, England refused any Jew to set foot on the British Isles between the 13th and the 17th century. No Jew was allowed into England. So they have a history of anti-Jewishness. So one of the main objectives of their Balfour Declaration was to reduce and redirect the influx of Jewish immigrants away from Great Britain. Both Lloyd George and James Balfour, the 2 members of the delegation, one was the Prime Minister, the other was the Secretary of State, were known anti-Semites. Leonard Stein, the author of one of the best books written on the Balfour Declaration, and a Jew himself, attributed to Lloyd George, and to quote, a streak of ordinary, vulgar anti-Semitism. Second, the belief of Lloyd George in specific in biblical prophecies, calling for the return of Jews to the Holy Land. These are the people who preceded the present movement in North America of the evangelicals, to which our great leader subscribes. And it is most unfortunate that, in essence, this movement is anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. Now, how is that? These believe in a theory called the rapture, that the Jews must be ingathered in Palestine. And when they ingather, Christ will come. And those who accept Christ will go back with him to heaven, and those who don't remain Jewish will perish. Can you imagine a Jewish leader, community leader or intellectual, would accept to shake hands with someone who believes in that? Do you want to coordinate policies with a movement that seeks in the end your extinction? Again, Lloyd George was of that bent. Now, the third was the support for the war effort. They came to believe that Jews of America, by then there was about 3 million of them, would be able to influence the American government to enter the war on the side of England. And that through their financial barons, they will be able to help England pay its war debts. Finally, it was believed that by establishing a Jewish colony estranged from its environment and dependent on Britain, that would fight for British interests, would secure the eastern plank of the Suez Canal. To the members of the Anglo-Jewish delegation, who were 2 primarily, Claude Montefiore, for one, who was an eminent from an eminent Jewish family and continues to be an eminent family in England. He wrote about his sentiments and sent this to his colleagues on the British cabinet. To quote, "The phrase a national home for the Jewish race appears to assume and imply that Jews generally constitute a nationality. Such an implication is extremely prejudicial to Jewish interests, as it is intensely obnoxious to an enormous number of Jews. It is very significant that anti-Semites are always very appreciative of Zionism." Menachem Begin was asked one time, "How do you work and collaborate with the Christian Zionists who believe in your extermination?" He said, "Anything." His reply was, "Anything that serves the interests of Israel is acceptable." Let us then move to the maps themselves. I had mentioned map 1 of StandWithUs, and I said, basically, it has no relevance because the problem is not a problem of race relations. There is no enmity between the Arab and the Jew. There is no enmity between Islam and Judaism. Remember, I'm saying Islam and Judaism, the two religions. I'm not talking about individuals, because that may be different. But if that be the case, then we know that the problem begins, as I mentioned, in the 19th century and begins outside of the region, in Europe. The rise of a new Jewish colonial movement, nationalist, the Jewish movement, called the Zionist movement, and its policies later on. Now, the first map of Palestine, which says 1946, reflects 3 items: the population of the land, land ownership, and the culture and demography and the culture of the Palestinian land. So 3 elements are being projected here: the number of the Palestinian population, of the people of the land, and those of the Palestinian Jews, the land ownership in Palestine, and third, the dominant culture in the country. And this is a map dated 1946. So it's before the rise of Israel and the partition of Palestine. The boundaries of the country, as you know, Mandate Palestine, was endorsed by the League of Nations and passed as a geopolitical entity in June of 1922. It was placed under a British administration with the express understanding that the mandate will be of a transitional nature and should lead to independence. Now, the mandate system held until 1947. For the 2 decades prior to the rise of the World Zionist Organization and 2 decades after its establishment, European Jewish immigration to Palestine did not exceed 50,000, mostly from the Pale of Settlement and Romania, areas where people didn't have much of a choice. They needed to run, and then they found that the Jewish organizations, Zionist organizations, and the British government later allowed them, opened the gates of the country. However, you notice that most European Jews refused to heed the call of the Zionist movement to immigrate to Palestine. At the end of the First World War, the Jewish population in Palestine counted 56,000 individuals who lived primarily in major cities and about 50 agricultural settlements. By 1946, this number increased to 680,000 with 259 settlements. 74% of the increase was due to immigration facilitated by the mandatory power. They constituted about 31% of the population in 1946, and they owned approximately 5.5% of the land of Palestine, or about 1.5%. By the early mandate system, it was about 1.5% of the area of Palestine. By 1946, as I mentioned, the population increased in numbers and formed about, and the ownership increased to about 5.66. At that time, 48% was private Palestinian land, and the remainder was public land. So what's offensive? You're giving a statement in 46, prior to the partition, of what the constitution of the country was. Well, that's not acceptable. What did the Stand With Us organization in its complaints, which was reproduced by the leadership of the Jewish establishment organizations in Vancouver and distributed to the media here, what was its objection? What was the complaint? Why is this not acceptable? For two reasons. It omits relevant information in a manner that is deceptive. Why? Because of the following. The entire area in green was not owned by Palestinian Arabs. Only around 50% of the area in green was privately owned by Palestinian Arabs. The rest was owned by England, by the British government. Pardon me, do you know anything about land ownership in Palestine and in most Muslim and Arab countries? There are 4 categories of land ownership. There is first, mulk, or ownership. This is private ownership. The Palestinians had about, at the time, owned about 48% of the area of Palestine. The Jews of Palestine owned 5.8%. The rest was public land, but public land was made of several categories. One was masha', public property. This is land owned collectively by the Palestinian communities. So in every community, part of its terrain was communally owned. So that's their land. The second part is called waqf, or endowment lands. And these are lands that are given in perpetuity to either religious endowments or to philanthropic organizations. So these are primarily Christian and Muslim endowments. So it is their property. And finally, there is the miri, or the government lands. And the government lands are lands whose produce benefits the government, the coffers of the government, for administration, to keep security and administration in the country. So who is it done for? It's for the people of the land. Now imagine if someone comes to tell you that all the parks of Canada don't belong to you, the people of Canada. It belongs to Harper and his group, the cabinet. Is that feasible? Of course not. So what are we talking about? Some 94% of the land of Palestine belong to Palestine, to the Palestinian community. And that's exactly what this map 1 tells you. So be conscious of it. Our second complaint about map 1 is that it is deceptive. Why? Because it implies, it doesn't say, it doesn't tell you, it doesn't depict, but it implies that Palestinian Arabs had a sovereign state in the territory of Palestine. Pardon me? They were under occupation, British occupation. So how do you want them to have an independent country? Now, keep in mind that these arguments are actually arguments that are continuously reproduced by Jewish Zionist organizations and by the spokespersons and government officials of the State of Israel. So what Stand With Us did here was basically get its arguments from the foreign ministry and then hit you with them that this is deceptive. Why? Because it's erroneous, as well as it doesn't say what it should say. So they want you to learn what to say. What about map 2? The second map of 1947, as you see, is the UN partition plan. It says that explicitly. Now, the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1947 divided the land against the will of the indigenous population, and despite the opposition of every single country in the region, in the Islamic world, and in most of the Third World. The people who voted for the partition of Palestine were primarily US and European. Why? Is it out of hate for the Jews? They didn't want them among them? So give them a land, give them a state, send them there. Now, as I had mentioned to you, under this partition, 57% of the best lands in Palestine were given to the Zionist organization to establish its state. They only owned 5.66, but were given 57%. Now, mind you, within the Jewish state itself, 55% of the population of the Jewish state, the expected Jewish state, were Palestinian Arabs, Christian, and Muslim. In other words, about 1/3 of the population with less than 6% ownership of the land was given a state in more than half the country in which the majority were Arab Palestinians. So this is the partition plan. Nothing magical, but no Stand With Us complaint. What was the complaint? The map contains unsupportable representations. Excuse me? It presents boundaries that never actually existed in reality. But who said they existed in reality? It is the goddamn partition plan of Palestine of 1947. I didn't tell you that it existed in reality. I told you that this was the plan being proposed. Now, why wasn't it implemented according to them? Because Arab leaders rejected it and launched a war to seize the entire Palestinian mandate. This is a long story with a lot of myths that surround it. For your knowledge, the Zionist organization in Israel, its leadership, had started in the mid-30s to develop its military plans for a forthcoming war. And what we know, that in the 1948 war that came about, the Jewish groups in Palestine under the leadership, Zionist leadership, had more men in the field and have a far more advanced weaponry and much better training. Sure, they will tell you there are tens of Arab countries. They sent 6 armies to invade Israel, the new state. What they don't tell you is that they began operations and they did not content themselves with the land allotted to a Jewish state. They actually expanded. And with their mighty military power and what they had, they were able to control 78% of the land of Mandate Palestine. So when you go to Plan 2 and Plan 3, this was what it tells you the result of the 1948 conflict, and where Israel took control of 78% of the land. But the most tragic element in the conflict is that the majority of the Palestinian population was pushed out of the country. A process of ethnic cleansing took part. What do we know about the ethnic cleansing that took place? There were in Palestine 674 villages and towns in Palestine, Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the war, there were only 99 remaining that were not impacted. And of these villages and towns that were impacted, more than 435 were totally demolished. And the population killed, injured, or thrown out of the country under the force of arms. And the towns and hamlets of the Palestinians were demolished, and Jewish settlements were either built on top of them or they became Jewish farms. You still go to Israel, and if you go to the countryside, many times you will see the remnants of Palestinian villages and towns. So a campaign of ethnic cleansing took place. And this was not by chance. What we know is the military high command had developed plans A, B, C, and D to face the war, the coming war. And Plan D, or Plan Dalet, called for the annexation of the whole territory of Palestine. But not just that, it called for the demolition of Palestinian places of residence and their expulsion from the country, because they felt that human element was the most dangerous to the security of the state in the future. Finally, Map 4 and 2002, which is named 2012. The fourth map shows that the only culturally independent Palestinian territory is Gaza and certain discontinuous parts of the West Bank, in which a limited measure of autonomy is exercised. But both Gaza and the West Bank remain either under siege or under direct military control of Israel. The land interrupted by Jewish-only Israeli settlements or colonies whose occupants presently number anywhere between 550,000 and 600,000. Remember, this territory includes East Jerusalem. Now comes StandWithUs and says, in its complaint, this map, Map 4, includes unsupportable representations. I look at it, and I see Gaza green, because its population remains there. And I see the West Bank with dots, spots, discontinuous. And the rest, either annexed or outside the control of the Palestinian community. So, by what stretch of the imagination is this map deceptive? In 1950, the Knesset passed legislation. It passed a law called the Absentee Ownership Law. A custodian was appointed, and the whole Palestinian ownership was given to the Jewish National Fund to own in perpetuity on behalf of what they call the Jewish people or Jewish nation. Palestinian Arabs who remained inside occupied Palestine at the time were left with 1% to 2% of their ownership. So when StandWithUs complaint says this is deceptive, in what manner is it deceptive? Because the green is labeled Palestine, and there's no sovereign state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. We are now negotiating. This is contested land. We're negotiating with the Palestinians. So wait until we end the negotiations and you'll find out what is Palestinian and what is Israel. Okay. Well, you know, I can't come to you, knock your door and say, this is a contested house. I want what I want. Of course, by the force of arms, you can do that, but neither by standards of morality or legality. And this is the tragedy of Palestine throughout the 20th century. At no point from the issuance of the Balfour Declaration to the establishment of the mandatory power, to the incoming of the Zionist movement and the migration, colonization of Palestine, to the establishment of an Israeli state, has the Palestinians ever had a chance, despite all their appeals, to have a court of law judge their case? Never. The only time it happened was 10 years ago. The only time. And it's important that we become aware of the incident. On December 8, 2003, the General Assembly of the United Nations submitted a question to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. Now, you know, the highest legal authority in the international system is the International Court of Justice. There is no higher. However, the system of this court is that it will consider issues referred to it by the United Nations, its agencies, or sovereign states. So the Palestinians never had a chance, because they've never been a sovereign state, to submit. So this time, it was a reference by the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice. And that's what allowed it to consider. The question that was submitted for an advisory opinion was the following. To quote, "What are the legal consequences arising from the construction of the wall being built by Israel, the occupying power, in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in and around East Jerusalem, considering the rules and principles of international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 and relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Fascinating. So an advisory opinion is sought. What was the decision of the court? The court issued its advisory opinion on July 9, 2004. And the highlights of this opinion were the following. One, all the territories occupied in 1967, including East Jerusalem, remain occupied territories, and Israel has the status of an occupying power. Although they were being asked about the war, the court decided it's not enough, and they need to go beyond. And what was that? That all of the territory occupied by Israel is Palestinian territory, and Israel is an occupying power, including East Jerusalem. So it's not a question of territory that's under contention, as the Israeli government has been telling us. Second, the existence of a Palestinian people is no longer an issue. That's what the court is telling us. It's no longer an issue. You can't come and tell me there's no Palestinian government, therefore you cannot discuss Palestine. The Palestinian people are a reality, and it is not an issue to be questioned, they told the Israelis. They have legitimate rights, which include the right to self-determination. Self-determination. That's what the International Court is saying. Would you give the Palestinians today the right to self-determination? Be my guest. Third, the Israeli settlements are contrary to the Fourth Geneva Convention. So these were the primary conclusions of the court. Sad enough, Western powers, including our government, who claim that they abide by international conventions and international laws, decided and called for setting the report aside. To conclude, the four maps contained in the Palestine Awareness Coalition, they provide an accurate account of the tragic fate of Palestinians and its Arab Palestinian population, both Muslim and Christian, and the unfortunate tragic fate of their lands, homes, and businesses, and the tragic fate of Palestinian culture in Palestinian lands. All three elements are disappearing within Mandate Palestine. These facts are incontestable. What StandWithUs and other Zionist organizations are doing are clearly an attempt at intimidation and the silencing of a group of citizens driven by a clear conscience and the desire to inform. The most interesting aspect of what is happening is the contrast between the two campaigns. While the campaign of the PAC, Palestine Awareness Coalition, has been historically accurate, tempered, and very effective, the StandWithUs campaign has been hysterical, vindictive, and morally bankrupt. What a welcome change. Thank you, Palestine Awareness Coalition. What a great job you've done. Thank you.
We will have over half an hour for questions, but I have a few announcements to make before we go there. First of all, I was remiss at the beginning to not acknowledge that we were on unceded Coast Salish territory, that this meeting was being held. Whereas we're dealing with, in Palestine, we're dealing with a settler colonial situation. In the room next door, the Micmac are meeting with another group of people, and they're dealing with another settler colonial civilization, Canada. And it's unfortunate that we had a conflict tonight, but it couldn't be avoided, as it turns out. And the BIAC committee, the Boycott Israel Apartheid Committee, made a donation of $100 to their meeting to help cover their expenses, and our regrets that we had a conflict of meetings. I also want to say that this last week, I think, has been particularly revealing to anybody that wants to have any sense of what Canadian foreign policy is about regarding Palestine. And not only our policy regarding Palestine, but the deeply embedded, corrupt, and sleazy relationships between this conservative government and Christian Zionism and the Zionist hierarchy in Canada. There can be no question. Anybody that wants to understand, the information is there for them to understand. And IJV has done a wonderful editorial about the Harper's plane load and the 208 people that were on it and who they represented in terms of Christian Zionist, anti-homophobic groups, groups that were associated with the Jewish Defense League, who's also associated with the fascist English Defense League. You're talking about really the most contemptible of the right wing in Canada that was on that trip to Israel. So that's what we're facing, and Dr. Farsi's brilliant explication of these maps gives you an idea of what we're up against in Vancouver and what difficulty there is in getting the truth out about the Palestinian situation. So I would ask you to give generously so that we can continue the work of the Palestine Awareness Committee, continue to put out ads or transit ads or other information to make the public aware of what's going on.